The Last Holiday Concert, Chapter 3, Misfire. Hart knew he was taking a risk. He didn't care. By his calculation, chorus was 10 times more annoying than anything else at school, which was saying a lot. Hart felt like chorus needed some excitement. And the risk? Well, that was part of the fun. The 6th grade chorus was trying to learn up on the housetop. Each boy and girl stood in front of a folding desk, and each of them held an old songbook. The music room was shaped like a half circle, and the 4 stair stepped levels made it look like the kids were standing on risers. The altos kept murdering their harmony part, so Mr. Minart was making everyone sing the first verse and the refrain again and again and again. Standing down at the front of the room behind an electric piano, he played the melody with his right hand, swung his left arm through the air to keep the rhythm, and sang out the alto part at the top of his lungs, trying to pound the notes into the heads of about 30 sixth-grade girls. He kept having to push his dark hair up off his forehead. His brown eyes flashed warning after warning, and his face got redder and redder. Anyone could see that Mr. Minart was in no mood for messing around. Hart had chosen the classic number 16 rubber band for today's raid. Before stretching, a number 16 rubber band measures 1/16 of an inch thick and 2.5 inches from end to end. It has an effective range of about 20 feet. In the hands of an expert, a number 16 is almost silent and remarkably accurate. You should get no ideas from this. Hart stood at the left side of the room with most of the other boys. His voice was pretty deep, so he wasn't up in the front row, and that was good. Keeping his eyes on Mr. Minart, Hart pulled a fresh number 16 out of his front pocket. He looped one end around the top corner of the stiff cover of his music book. He stretched the rubber band back about 4 inches and then pressed it against the edge of the book with his index finger. He was loaded and ready. Hart raised the music book and shifted his weight so he had a clear launch path between Jimmy Lohman and Bill Ralston. He felt his hands begin to sweat. As they sang "Ho, ho, ho, who wouldn't go," Mr. Minart turned to face the girls just as he had before, and Hart lifted his finger. The rubber band zipped past Jimmy's right ear, traced a graceful arc in front of the rolling blackboard, bounced once on Mr. Minart's slanted music stand, and then stuck on the front of his sweater. A little tan circle on the dark green wool. Mr. Minart didn't notice it. He did notice a flutter of giggles in the room, but he stopped them with a shake of his head. The song went on. Hart should have stopped while he was ahead, but he didn't. He pulled out a fresh rubber band, and before he loaded it onto the edge of the music book, Hart twisted it into a double loop to give it extra force. He was going to put this one up into the fluorescent lights above Mr. Minart's head. He pulled back the doubled rubber band, adjusted his aim, and at the next up on the housetop click, 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 Hart released shot number 2. Maybe his finger slipped. Maybe Hart had stretched the band too far. Or maybe he shouldn't have used the double loop, because the rubber band flew straight and fast and hard, and it snapped smack into the side of Mr. Minart's neck. The piano stopped as Mr. Minart jerked his head like he'd been stung by a bee. He slapped at his neck and ducked his head, looking around quickly, trying to spot a hornet or a wasp. Some of the kids laughed, and Mr. Minart knew he must have looked silly. He smiled, held his hand up to quiet everyone down. He said, "Okay, show's over. Let's take it from the beginning of the refrain again." He looked down at his piano. That's when he saw the rubber bands, one on the keyboard and the other hanging on his sweater. Mr. Minart's eyes narrowed. His lips twitched and slowly twisted into an angry frown. There was a hushed moment of calm, and then the storm. "Who?" he boomed. "Who did this?" Eyes flashing, he snatched up the rubber bands, pinching them between his thumb and forefinger. He shook them out in front of his face. "Who?" he shouted again. "Who shot these?" He stalked out from behind his piano. "Who? Tell me right now." A man who gets hopping mad, who gets so angry that he sputters and spits and stomps around, all red in the face with his eyes bugging out and his teeth showing. In a comedy movie or a TV show, that can be very funny. In real life, it's not. Realizing that the shots must have come from his right, Mr. Minart spun to face the boys. "Now," he bellowed. "Tell me now. Who did this?" Mr. Minart looked quickly from face to face, and when he locked eyes with Hart, he knew. "You," he pointed at Hart's face. "It was you, right? Right? Answer me." Hart couldn't think. He had never seen a teacher this angry before. All his coolness melted. Hart gave a guilty little nod. In a flash, Mr. Minor had a hold of Hart's arm, steering him toward the door. They were out of the room and down the hall to the office in 15 seconds. The man walked so fast, Hart had to trot to keep from being dragged along. Breathing hard, Mr. Minor's face was still twisted with anger. Through clenched teeth, he kept saying, "Very funny, very funny." The door to the principal's office was closed, and Mr. Minor knocked and pushed it open in one move. Mr. Richards looked up from the papers on his desk as Mr. Minor shouted, This young man thought it would be funny to shoot me in the neck with a rubber band." The principal looked from Mr. Minor's bright red face to Hart's pale one. He nodded at Mr. Minor and said, "You can let go of his arm. He's not going to run away." Mr. Minor dropped Hart's arm. Then he held up a rubber band and said, "This is the one that hit me in the neck." Mr. Richards looked at Hart. "Is that right, Hart? Did you shoot that rubber band?" Hart gulped and found his voice. I did shoot it, but I wasn't aiming it at him, honest. And I'm sorry. I was aiming way above him, at the lights. Really." "Oh, sure," said Mr. Minor, shouting again. "And it just happens to hit me right in the neck." Holding up the rubber band, he said, "And what about this one? The one that stuck on my sweater? I suppose you were aiming this one at the lights, too." The principal stood up. "Mr. Minor, please. There's no need to shout. I'd like you to go back to your classroom now. Is there anyone there supervising the children?" "Well, no," said Mr. Minor, but it was an attack. It was an emergency." Mr. Richards nodded. "I understand what you're saying, and we'll get it all sorted out, but you need to go back to your classroom. I'll deal with Hart." Mr. Minor turned, gave Hart a last angry look, and stomped out of the office. Mr. Richards sat back down in his chair. Hart looked across the desk at him. "Really, I didn't mean to hit him. And that first shot, I aimed it at his music stand, and then the rubber band bounced onto his sweater. It just bounced. That's the way it happened. I swear I wasn't trying to hit anybody." Mr. Richards looked at Hart a long moment and then said, "I believe you, that hitting him was an accident. But there's no excuse for shooting rubber bands in the first place. If that rubber band had hit Mr. Minor in the eye, we'd be looking at a big problem here. Do you have any more?" Hart dug into his pocket and then dumped the rubber bands onto the desk. "How about in your locker?" Hart shook his head. "No, that's all I have." Mr. Richards said, "I'm keeping you after school today and tomorrow. Come here to the office, and I expect you to bring homework or a book to read. Is that clear?" Hart nodded. Then he said, Can I call my mom? She doesn't get home until a half hour after I do, and she doesn't like my little sister to be alone after school." Mr. Richards glanced at his watch. I see. In that case, you can serve your detention starting tomorrow. Tell your parents that you'll be staying after school for 1 hour, both tomorrow and Friday, and tell them why. And no more rubber bands at school. Understood?" Hart nodded. Then he said, So I can go now?" Mr. Richards nodded. "Yes, you may go." Hart left the principal's office, but as he reached the door to the hallway, Mr. Richards called, "Wait a second, Hart." Hart stopped and turned back. Mr. Richards said, "Did you leave any belongings in the music room?" Hart shook his head. "No, my book bag's in my locker." Mr. Richards pointed at the long bench against the wall of the main office. "Then I want you to sit right there until this period is over." Hart said, "Okay," and he walked over and sat down. After Mr. Richards shut his door, Hart turned and looked up over his shoulder until he could see the clock above him. It was 1:44. That meant he had 9 minutes to wait and think. At first, all Hart could think about was the crazed, angry look on Mr. Minor's face. The guy had totally flipped out. Considering everything, Hart felt like he had gotten off easy, and he felt like Mr. Richards was a pretty good guy. He felt like the principal had saved him from Mr. Minor. The principal was smart, too, because Hart understood why the man had told him to wait in the office until the period was over. Mr. Richards didn't think it would be a good idea for Hart and Mr. Minor to be in the same room again, at least not right away, and Hart agreed completely. Chapter 4. Bad Behavior. At 7 minutes after 3, Mr. Minor stormed into the principal's office. "Please, Please tell me I didn't just see that Evans kid getting on a bus to go home, out there laughing and joking around with all his buddies. Tell me I'm seeing things, like a kid who shoots a teacher with a rubber band going home instead of staying after school. Tell me I'm blind. Tell me I'm crazy. Tell me something. Anything. Mr. Richards got up and closed the door. David, this is the second time today I've had to ask you not to shout in my office. Please sit down. I don't want to sit down. Mr. Richards glared at him. He pointed at one of the blue plastic chairs in front of his desk. David, sit. The principal sat in the other blue chair. Yes, that was Hart, and you saw him getting on that bus because both his parents work, and his mom expects him to be at home with his younger sister after school. It would have been difficult for the parents if Hart had stayed for detention today. If a boy misbehaves, we punish the boy, not his parents. So relax. Starting tomorrow, Hart will be staying after school for the next 2 days. Mr. Minor popped up halfway out of his chair. 2 days? Only 2 days? Mr. Richards nodded. That's right. 2 days detention. I don't believe Hart hit you on purpose, and he's staying after school 2 days for shooting rubber bands at school. That's fair, and that's the end of it. So let it go, David. Do you understand me? Let it go. Or what? Asked Mr. Minert. You can't fire me twice. Mr. Richards paused. He had had a feeling this was going to come up. In a gentler voice, he said, You haven't been fired, David, and you know it. It's a town budget crisis. All the schools are cutting staff. I told you that a month ago, and I had nothing to do with deciding that the art and music teachers would be the first ones to go. I know that losing your job is upsetting, but you cannot let your personal situation affect your behavior at school. My behavior? Mr. Minor made it all the way to his feet on that one. What do you mean, my behavior? David, sit down. I'm talking about this afternoon with Hart. You overreacted, and I had to ask you to let go of the boy's arm. Do you have any idea how big a problem that could have been for you and for the school district? What if you had made bruises on Hart's arm? What if you had hurt his shoulder? That could have been on the evening news today, and for all we know, it still might be. The kind of anger you displayed today was completely unprofessional, so that's the behavior I'm talking about. Mr. Minor turned and looked out the windows. The last 2 buses were pulling away. The principal kept talking. I'm sorry about the town's money problems, and I'm very sorry your job will end on January 1st. You have a right to be upset about that. It is a rotten Christmas present. You're a terrific music teacher, David, and I hate losing you, but there's nothing I can do about it. I did get the school board to keep your names out of the local news until the Christmas vacation begins, and I understand why you and the other why you and the other teachers made that request. It'd be even worse with everyone walking around feeling sorry for you. So we all just have to make the best of a bad situation. Make the best of it, said Mr. Minor, still facing the windows. Easy for you to say. No, said Mr. Richards. It's not easy. We went through this 8 years ago, the same thing, and there's nothing easy about it. Not for me, not for anyone. Mr. Minor didn't respond, so the principal added, If there were anything I could do about this, I'd have done it by now. I'm still hoping the district can come up with the money we need before the end of the year, but that's a long shot. And if I can help with recommendations as you look for other jobs, you know I've got nothing but good things to say about you and your work. Mr. Minor just sat there, his face turned away. After an awkward silence, Mr. Richards said, Listen, we've got a faculty meeting in 15 minutes and I've got to get ready, so I'll see you there. The music teacher stood up. I won't be at the meeting. Mr. Richards said, Oh, then I guess I'll see you tomorrow. Mr. Minor nodded and walked out of the office.